Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome everyone to ILS online book launch with Dr. Patel. I'm glad everyone can join and take part in it. Now, a bit of introduction to the Sheikh. He's the founder and the chair of Friends of Aqsa, a visiting fellow at the University of Leeds and director of Islam Expo, and author of several books, including the one that we're going to discuss today, The Muslim Problem from British Empire to Islamophobia, a brief history of Palestine and Medina to Jerusalem. And we're going to discuss his latest publication, which is the one that I mentioned, and get him to talk about why he wrote it, the reason behind it, and also the implication. Before I hand that to the Sheikh, I encourage everyone to visit his project, the Friends of Aqsa. It is personally, I'm very close to this project, and I think it's a very, very important project. So we should all, inshallah, have whenever we have chance to visit and benefit from it. Sheikh, you can take over, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair for that. Jazakallah Abdul Hai for inviting me to the Islamic Literary Society. It's an honor to join you and your members, try and hopefully discuss the book. Now, of course, the book has taken several years to write. It's been a long-term project and was part of my PhD, which I finished about 2 years ago. Hence, I think in the 30 minutes we've got, I won't be able to cover everything what's inside the book, but hopefully pick up certain aspects and points which I think are quite relevant to myself, and I think to the Muslim community, and I think to the wider British society as well. So I hope let's hope it makes a lot of sense at the end of it, and we can all benefit, and myself in particularly, hopefully as I speak, hopefully I'll be able to sort of try and remind myself why I wrote these things and what implications that has for our community. Now, as most books begin, normally, especially the academic books, they normally start off how they're going to do their research and what methodology they used and approach, so that people understand the framing of the book. I use a slightly different approach. I start off not of doing how I wrote the book, but why I wrote the book. And the why is very important for me. It was the reason I wanted to write this, and the reason I wanted to go into postgraduate study is to understand my own position as a Muslim subject. Why was it that going through my own personal history and my own personal story, when I came to Britain, I was not known or be identified as a Muslim. I was originally identified as a Black person. This was in the 70s. And then my identity sort of ricocheted between Asian and Pakistani, but never a Muslim. It was only in late 89, and particularly if we were to put a point, at the time of Salman Rushdie affair, that I became identified as a Muslim. And of course, I was a Muslim right throughout from my birth, alhamdulillah. And I knew I was a Muslim. But I don't think anybody identified me as a Muslim or wanted to categorize me into that pigeonhole and then put tropes and bring forth my Muslimness and problematize that. It happens at a specific juncture in my life, and I believe that resonates with the majority of the people in the country. So that's why I wrote the book, to understand this change in identity from being a Black person, when I came early in the 1970s, to repeat myself, I was called a Black person or categorized as a Black person. Then I was categorized with an identity of an Asian, sometimes a Pakistani, and then a Muslim. So this change over. So what does identity do to you? What does it make any difference what you call by? I mean, who determines identity? Is it yourself, somebody else who imposes it upon you? And what are the meanings and connotations of all this? Now, to frame this, then I take the next step is try and understand how best to approach this. Of course, there are many ways and means, but I take a path called the critical Muslim studies approach. And this is an approach rather than a methodology. So it's not how to do stuff, but it's simply how to inform yourself to do research. And that's a very distinct difference. And I think it's very important to identify that. So I use a critical Muslim studies approach, which is pioneered by Salman Saeed in University of Leeds and a few other scholars now around the world. And you can look this up to see how we can also help you and try and formulate ideas, understand the status of the Muslims or even the global society itself. So that's my first chapter. I'm trying to understand myself, my positioning, my subject positioning as a Muslim, and how to get to understand that by using critical Muslim studies. What also that allows me to do is to introduce new terms. And there's a new term I introduce in the book called scotoma. Now, scotoma is borrowed from ophthalmology, being the background of optometry. What it shows, or what it's trying to reveal, is that it's not a blind spot where researchers normally talk about a blind spot where you can't see something, or neither is it an inability to identify something that should be there. Okay, so what a scotoma does is it's a new term that helps us identify where people and individuals remain absent of a certain knowledge, despite that knowledge have been taken away from them. So in order to get to that, aspect of knowledge that has been hidden from them, is something that requires revealing and, if you like, an archaeological approach towards the study. So, for example, if we look at colonialism itself, it is very telling that we learn a lot about how material appropriation takes place, how people are subjugated, and how their rights have been violated. But we learn very little about their epistemology, about their knowledge sources, about how they thought, how they valued things, the concepts they used and what it meant to them. So this helps, scotoma identifies that, and hopefully it allows a researcher to look behind the subjugation and try and understand how people are undermined. And I think that works very importantly for me because it helped me try and see why my one particular type of identity was emphasized over others and others were hidden for the rest. So whereas if you are a white person in Britain, you're free to have multiple identity. In fact, it's celebrated. So you could be a football supporter of a particular team. You could have a certain dietary needs. You could have a certain, you could be identified from the music you like. You could be identified from all sorts of different aspects. But a Muslim is primarily identified only through his Muslimness. Everything else is hidden. And this idea, I think, is very, very important. That brings us to the very first idea that I explore, and that is Islamophobia itself. Now, that is central to the book, and it's a thread that runs throughout, and it connects all the chapters. Try and understand what I talked about, my personal identity that emerges or ruptures during the time of Salman Rushdie affair, and how Islamophobia, or the targeting of Muslimness, then takes hold on the Muslim community and me as a subject as well. So the first thing is, of course, I go through the idea of the term itself and the nuances that Islamophobia is some literalist translation as a phobia of Islam and whether it should be accepted as a term or not. What I turn that on is to consider that Islamophobia has now become a paradigm. In academic terms, this is a Kuhn's principle that something, when it becomes almost hegemonic in the studies, where people are now investigating that idea and concept by doing different type of research, different methodology, trying to find out how accurate it is to the concept itself, you have reached a stage where it's a paradigm. And Islamophobia, I show in the book, has reached the stage of a paradigm. And then, of course, the several aspects of Islamophobia that we must be very, very careful about of how we articulate Islamophobia. The first is the politics of definition. Now, in Britain, unfortunately, the government has not been accepting the APPG definition or the community's need proposed definition of Islamophobia as a type of racism that targets expression of Muslimness and perceived Muslimness. So how do we define a definition? And the politics of definition can be broken down into several factors. The first is, what does a definition do? Why do we need a definition? At the outset, we must say that by adopting a definition, we are not saying that Islamophobia will be eliminated. No definition will help eliminate Islamophobia, but it has its merits. What a definition would help is, of course, it will help us record the cases of Islamophobia. It would help the police in particularly be more coherent up and down the country to record it. It could also help with the legislature to be able to identify and bring about laws against Islamophobia. At the judiciary level, those who would then be accused of Islamophobia would be judged on a more on a level that is acceptable. So hence a definition is important, but it is also accepted, right, as I mentioned right at the beginning, it will not solve the problem of getting rid of Islamophobia. Once we understand that, I think the formulation of the definition is very important, that it should be simple, it should be understood by the majority of the people, it should be able to be comprehended and also travel the societies and the different aspects of society, just in the Muslim community, but right across the spectrum of different society, and if possible, internationally as well. So there is uniformity of understanding. I did something different on the section of Islamophobia, is I looked at all the theses that was submitted to British universities on the subject of Islamophobia and try and assess what were the commonalities and what were the differences between all those theses that were submitted to British universities on Islamophobia. What I found was three things in particular. There was an idea that was running on some PhD theses and also in literature as well, and this also collaborated with literature as well, was that somehow Muslim-British relationship has always been antagonistic. So there's that one idea, which I think was very important to address, which I do. The second is Islamophobia being a reserve of the far right. Somehow Islamophobia belongs to the far right. You know, it's a fringe idea. Somehow it has become a bit common, but you know, the mainstream is not involved in Islamophobia itself. And the third aspect that I wanted to look at as well is the global nature of Islamophobia. So these are the three aspects that I touch upon and try and elaborate. Regarding the first point, I challenge the very idea that the Muslim-British relationship has always been antagonistic. And I show that by giving different episodes in history between the relationship of British and Muslims to show that there were certain periods. First is to can't collapse the whole Muslim sphere into a single space or time, and Britain as well in the same context. So if you think of how Britain had a relationship with the Ottoman Empire, varied as how they had it with Tipu Sultan, and how it varied with Muslims in Africa, and how Muslims were enslaved and how they treated the Muslim slaves. So you have a very varied approach. And I think it's very dangerous to assume that all the time the Muslim-British relationship has always been antagonistic. There were periods of antagonism. There was periods with certain Muslims that was antagonistic, with others it wasn't. And even if we look at the antagonistic period, I suppose one of the strongest period was during the time of the Crusaders, when Britain was informed, but the British people and the European context was there. When they had a relationship with the Muslim sphere, that was antagonistic, but that was not based on Muslimness. So if you look at all the literature during the Crusaders, the reason the Crusaders went to the east, to Jerusalem, and wanting to take over Jerusalem and conquer Jerusalem was not simply because of its Muslimness. There were many other connotations, and I argue there's many internal factors rather than external factors. And I expand that in the book. Similarly, regarding the next concept of Islamophobia being reserved of the far right. Now, as we know, Islamophobia has almost become a winning ticket in the democratic world. And the more the parties are right-wing, the more mandate they get, and more likely to win elections. In fact, in Poland, just before the recent crisis of Ukraine, the party that came into power was on the ticket that they would not allow a single Muslim refugee to enter Poland. And you see this change so that it becomes a mainstream. So how does Islamophobia, how can we understand Islamophobia becoming a mainstream concept and idea? And I argue that there's, as far as Islamophobia is concerned, the left-right political categorization that we have is breached. It doesn't hold anymore. There is a consensus across society that Muslimness, or the tropes of Muslimness, are problematic, and they are in need to be checked, governed, and marginalized in certain contexts. And this, I think, is very, very important as well. And it's an aspect that I argue very strongly in the book. Finally, I talk about the global nature of Islamophobia. How can we understand the global nature of Islamophobia? And here, to break down the globe, I do it through ideological concepts. So I break down the first sphere as the Eurocentric sphere, where Muslims are in the minority. And here we have most of Europe, America. Within that sphere, I suppose we could also add, to a certain extent now, India, Israel, and countries like that, where we have a right through Orientalist Eurocentric perspective in which how they perceive the Muslims. But there's a second sphere as well, and this is where the dominant Muslim communities reside. So these are the Middle East countries, places like Egypt and Saudi Arabia and UAE and so forth, and maybe even Indonesia and Malaysia, where there's Islamophobia as well. So Muslims are exercising Islamophobia. Here I show that Islamophobia travels from the Eurocentric zone to the second sphere, where there's majority Muslim countries, because the elites in that country want to promote Eurocentrism in their countries, respective countries. And of course, there are many other geopolitical reasons of being able to continue to hold power and everything else. But what you have is, if you look at the narrative against Muslims in the second sphere, where Muslims are the majority, you see that the parallels are drawn against Muslims being identified as being anti-Eurocentric, or the ideas of Eurocentrism itself, of Enlightenment values, of modernity and democracy and so forth, despite the fact that majority of the leaders in these countries, in Muslim dominant countries, are autocratic, if not right-wing fascist dictators. So you see there's a second sphere, but then there's a third sphere as well, a sphere that does not align itself with Eurocentrism, countries like Rohingya and China and Russia, where there's also Islamophobia. So how does Islamophobia then also become resonant? It doesn't travel from the east, or from the west rather, from Eurocentric circle to them, but it actually resonates. It allows them to become more Islamophobic. And this I look at through the eye of war on terror, in which the Muslim subject itself is being shown to be a threat to the society, wherever they are, to the indigenous society or the indigenous nations idea of indigenous nations. So Indianness, Chineseness, Russianness, and you see, again, a lot of languages and examples that I use to try and make that point. So that's the chapter on Islamophobia. And just to summarize, because I think this is the most important chapter in the book, which ties the whole book together, is the very idea of Islamophobia, how we should accept the definition, its merits and its shortfalls as well, how we should understand the British-Muslim relationship historically, Islamophobia not being reserve of the far right, and also the global nature of Islamophobia. And then, of course, I started asking the question about identity. You know, how does identity itself play its role? Because if I took my own example, is when I came into Britain, if I was known as a black person, and then an Asian, and then a Pakistani, and then a Muslim, what does it mean? What does this identity mean? How can we understand identity? Now, I take a relational position here. I don't think identity is projected by yourself, neither is it imposed by others. But there's an interplay between the projected and the imposed. And that is a battle of the political. There's a battle of the political here. That's a space that's created on how one should be perceived, on how should be recorded, on how should be thought of. And I show this by taking certain examples and to show that identity is always relational in relation to somebody else. You only make sense who you are in relation to somebody else. If there was no somebody else, no other, not necessarily other as in other undermined, but any other person, then that the identity's merits do not make sense. And then I proceed to show that Britishness itself had gone through certain history of itself, where it was identified against the Catholics and the French, but more importantly, that then moves in the 17th century, and Britishness becomes in relation to the colonized. So first I explained that identity is relational, and thereafter I show that Britishness itself is identified in relation to the colonized. And it's a long chapter, and this chapter is theoretical, but it is a very, very important chapter, because what it shows that if you think about Britishness, internally there's so many differences between the Scots, the Irish, the Welsh, and the English, yet those differences were not big enough to break down any idea of Britishness. And the reason that happens is those internal differences are deflected because of a greater external difference. And the external difference was provided by the colonized. And it is only through that those who were oppressed within Britain, so in particularly the Irish I'm thinking about, and the Catholics, they became the champions for colonization. The Scottish were in the forefront, who refused at one stage to become part of Britain. They became the main bulwark supporters for the occupation of the Mughal Empire. So you see this internal deflection for the creation of Britishness only makes sense in context of the occupied. And of course, those occupied provided different type of connotations and reference points. And in here is the insertion of the Muslim figure, because the Muslim figure then becomes very, very pivotal to what it means to be British. Of course, all colonized played a part, in particularly the Africans, the slaves. Everybody who was colonized was considered as inferior to Britishness. Culturally, socially, economically, Britain had a right to do whatever they liked to them. But here, I bring in the figure of the Muslims by an example of Tipu Sultan. And not only Tipu Sultan, but I also show 3 or 4 other concepts to show how Britishness itself and imperialism, imperial Britishness, is shown to be moving forward and it's being obstructed by things like pan-Islamism, the Ummah, the Muslim sphere, and the Caliphate. So these ideas and concepts that are now, I show that how this is just not theoretical. I show in the book how this was elaborated in common languages, in literature, in plays at the time, in drawings, and how these messages were spread. And in particularly, and then as I mentioned earlier, I use the figure of Tipu Sultan and show how when Tipu Sultan confronted the British for 32 years to stop the expanse of the East India Company into his territory of Mysore, how his representation in the metropole, in London, in Britain, then brings about the idea of a Muslim figure, then showing as a pan-Islamist, as an ummatic idea, as part of a Muslim sphere, part of the Khilafat that undermines the very need to civilize the world. So there, Muslims then become an obstruction, and Britain and Britishness itself becomes in relation to not only the colonized generically, but in specific turned towards the Muslim figure. And this Muslim figure, of course, Britain then collapses, its empire disappears, and post the empire, Britain then is left in a traumatic position, not because they'd lost the resources or because they'd lost the land. Of course, all those played its part, but because Britishness itself would have now no meaning. And that's why you see a change post the First World War and Second World War in particular, where the former colonized, when they were invited into Britain initially to help Britain, if you like, economically revitalize itself, those people who are coming in were now being labeled as blacks. So that Britishness itself then become internally differentiated. Before it was being externally differentiated or in relation to the colonized, thereafter it becomes internally differentiated from the black people. And black here is just not the skin color, but everybody who came from the former colonized region were categorized as black. Of course, that did not bode well in the post-Holocaust era, in the time of United Nations making racism, having a resolution against UN resolutions against racism and laws against racism and so forth. And hence then you have a breakdown of the category of the Asian, Pakistani, and then the emergence of Muslims. And the point about this at 1989 is also very important. Several other factors that I bring to the fore is that generally it is thought that, you know, when Muslims marched against Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses, a book, they were somehow violent, they were somehow disturbing the sensitivity of enlightenment, the freedom of speech, freedom of expression. They were trying to bring about censorship. The reality was Britain, I mean, you just have to look up 1970s Britain. It was, every city in Britain, major city in Britain had riots, nothing to do with Muslims. From the left wing, the people of Afro-Caribbeans wanting justice, wanting to quench the racism that was so rife, economic problems. So there were demonstrations for everything. In fact, there were demonstrations against Margaret Thatcher in the 80s as well for going so right and creating an individualist society. So there were demonstrations against poll tax, and we can recall so many things that were happening, much more violent than whatever Muslims did. In fact, I give a specific example of the Sikh community. They demonstrated in London, I think the figure is something like 50,000, and they demonstrated with their swords unsheathed and waving in the air against Indian government attacking their temple. Yeah. So what was important here is that the Muslim action itself did not create a problem. It was a problematizing of the Muslim action. So the Muslim action, or the Muslim demonstrations and the Muslim request to be accepted as normal, because what Muslims were doing is they were also asking what was being practiced by everybody, almost every group that felt victimized. So we had many plays being pulled during that time. We had many songs that were being pulled during that time. And Muslims were doing the same thing. But Muslims were, of course, as I mentioned earlier, because of the crisis in Britishness itself, Muslims became a target, became a very, very easy target, not only to show them as being anti-enlightenment, anti-modern, but also link them with the fatwa of Ayatollah Khomeini to have an international connection. So they became a fifth column within Britain, that this is a group of people who have an international alliance. They do not have alliance with Britain. And they use the signifiers of freedom of expressions, of censorship and fatwa to try and undermine Muslims. And unfortunately, I think it worked for the right wing, and it empowered them to castigate the Muslims as the other. But that was the beginning. And most importantly, I think what we need to understand is the creation of the Muslim problem then becomes global, because the Satanic Verses was not just constrained to Britain, but it was a global issue as well. and you see the similar repertoire of identifying Muslims around the globe. And this changeover of how, if I take my own personal example, that when I came in, my identity was not Muslims, then ruptures during the time of Satanic Verses affair. And then the idea of Muslims comes forward. I also go into quite in depth of trying to understand the author's intention and classify words as what is provocative. That's a theoretical discussion on the aspect of how Muslims saw, they did not see the book itself, or the words in themselves, as something very unheard of, because Muslims are very much aware that the Prophet was maligned from the very first time he started giving the message of Islam. So this was nothing new. It's in part of Muslims' historicity. We have always been there. What riled Muslims, particularly against Satanic Verses, is what I call the duplicity of the author as being a Black Orientalist, in the sense that he undermines the aspirations. Remember, he came from the left wing. He, at one stage, was championing the causes of the undermined, the former colonized, and all of a sudden he had turned and tried and then undermine the very people people thought that he was their ally. And that shock, I think, played its part as well within that. And then, of course, having outlined the very assessment and looked at the idea of how an identity is created, how it's relational, how Islamophobia emerges, not just only in Britain, but then it sort of becomes how to understand the global nature of Islamophobia itself. And then the idea of Britishness and British Muslim relationship and how that has over the time changed. And in a way, that also brings us, or allows us, in the final section in the book, to see how we can address the crisis that we face in Britain. The right, I won't say right wing, but the xenophobic, Islamophobic society that has emerged or becoming established in Britain. How can we counter that? And I argue for a post-racist society rather than a post-racist society, because we have to be very, very careful. We cannot talk about all being equal. We cannot talk about all being to be accepted as one. What we need to do is to accept our differences. And that's a post-racist society where we accept that there's different types of race in quote unquote here. I don't accept the idea of race, but to make people understand the common language that we use, that there's people of different cultures, background, and each one of them has to be accepted for who they are. And this is, if you like, a decolonial approach, because it's not talking about multiculturalism. It's not talking about countering just simply discrimination, which should all take place. And we should always have, try and do education, bring about a legal definition, demand an apology for all the colonialist and imperialist actions taken by the British government in the past, bring about civil rights movement. I think that's extremely important. But what this does not call for is a multicultural Britain approach that we have had, because what that does is, in fact, it forces assimilation of certain group of people into the dominant hegemonic idea of what Britain should be. We challenge that very central concept to say that Britain has changed, and Britain for the future Britain has to be strengthened from what it is at present. And the present means Muslims, in particularly in this context, are part of that. So when we talk about Britain, a future Britain, Muslims should fit into that idea, that common sense. And what I mean by common sense here is a concept from Gramsci, that when we talk about an idea or a concept or a people, it conjures up certain images in our head. So when we talk about Britain, invariably, if we think about what Britain is, you could think about rolling fields of the country and valleys and so forth. But if you think about the people of Britain, it's almost always white people. And that has become common sense because that is what has been drummed into us through different representation of Britain, either through art, literature, through media, through different forms, in fact, through every other form. And that common sense idea of Britain has to change, and it has to include Muslims into that measure. And that common sense is something we have to work on. It's a very long-term project, and that is a project, a decolonial, if you like, a critical Muslim studies project, to be able to do that. Because what is it? Why is it difficult? Because what we have now is Britishness itself is trying to preserve its colonial past privileges. In effect, it's trying to reformulate those. So those who had privileged themselves during the colonial period continue to benefit those. And those who are benefiting, or the privileged class, will not surrender those privileges quite easily. And hence we have an uphill struggle to be able to challenge that. So that's, in summary, some of the aspects I've covered in the book. I think I spoke for over half an hour now. So we'll take on questions, and I hope I haven't been too fast or not been too complex and been comprehensible to most of you. Jazakallah khair.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Patel. You answered a lot of questions that was posted. I suppose to start off, you did answer this question to some extent, but if you can kind of expand on it, who benefits from Islamophobia, and what is the outcome, the target? What do they want? Do they want to kind of demonize the Muslim, or do they want to kind of remove them? You know, what's the end goal? Who does it, and why do they do it? And you know, what do they want from that project?
Well, I think Muslims provide a very specific challenge to Britishness. Not because Muslims are particularly different, but Muslims introduce alternatives. And that alternative is what threatens them. So in a way, it comes from a weakness of Eurocentric Orientalist ideas. If you think about what the fear of Muslimness is based on, they talk about Muslims being allied globally. You know, and there's a very, I expand the work here of Salman Said, who talks about Muslims being deterritorialized and then re-territorialized as the Ummah. So they don't fit into the concept of a nation state. So I'll give you an example. Muslims are, in one stage, considered they're linked to the world community, the world Muslim community. So British Muslims are linked to, in the time of Salman Rushdie, to Iran, now to either sometimes called Pakistan or India or Bangladesh or certain countries in Middle East. If you show any sympathy with any of the Muslim oppressed people around the world, you are then immediately linked with them. And this creates a problem within the nation state concept, because they see this link as a fear of a domination or a construct of the West, which is based on nation states. And of course, this goes back to the Westphalia, This idea goes back to the Westphalian Treaty, where the emergence of the nation state takes place. And Muslims, therefore, are seen to be challenging this concept that, yes, you can be a member of a nation state, but you can also be an individual who has concern globally. You know? And it doesn't have to be other Muslims. I mean, we have that in environment, and people seem to accept that. But when it comes to other relative people, particularly the nation state structures, seem to be very, very concerned about that. Also, the freedom of speech. If you think about what Muslims consider, and particularly in here, I think the symbol of the niqab and the hijab is very, very important, that we have sisters who will go against what is perceived, or what is projected rather, by the Eurocentrics as considered liberated. They go against that very idea and consider it as their freedom to dress however they like. So that's the challenge. So in effect, you see the actions against Muslims, not because Muslims have a particular army or they're going to occupy the lands, or they know none of us are going to do that. But they're fearful more than that is of the alternatives. That here's a community that provides an alternative social, political, economic structures. Even economically, there's different structures that Muslims, that emerge from the Muslim sphere and Muslim understandings that also go against the grain of capitalism. And these are the concerns that are posed. So Muslims provide a specific challenge to the West. And to flip that is, in a way, I pick up a word called Westernese, where Western supremacy itself is challenged. That not everything that comes from the West is superior. Not everything from the West is the best. There is the rest out there, and the rest has to make an input. We also, as a community, as a historical community, also challenge the very idea that intelligence and enlightenment values and the very idea of thinking and critical analysis somehow emerged in the West. That this was a preserve of white people from Greece to Rome to straight to Europe. It's very difficult to ignore the Muslim figure. And this kind of challenges that tries to bring about parity, to say, no, there are other people in the world who also exceeded, and we are equal. Sometimes certain group exceeded over the others, there's no doubt about that. But there's parities, and that is very, very important for us to understand. So you see, and the final part of your question is the idea of the end game. Well, I think nobody has we should be very, very careful. I don't think there's a conspiracy or there's a group of people who sit around a table and saying, what should you do for the future of Muslims in Europe or in America? I don't think that ever happens. But there's a trajectory. And that trajectory, I'm afraid, at the moment doesn't look very good. Because what happens is every aspect of Muslimness is being challenged. And the Muslims are asked and demanded for their loyalty to the country they live in. They're wanting to be part beyond any other community to comply with the institutionalized aspect of what that nationness includes, either the Britishness, Frenchness, talk about Austrianness, any country in Europe, or Americanness. We are somehow demanded to be more than the indigenous. So all this path that now it's demanding the assimilation of Muslims into something that the nation itself is almost manufacturing, means Muslims are likely to lose their own identity. And that identity which you're fighting for, remember I mentioned right at the beginning that the identity is neither projected nor imposed, but there's a battle between the two, and that battleground is called the political. And that is where we need to occupy the political region to make sure that the historicity we have and the equality we demand and the parity we want to impose, to exercise, is something we should carry on with.
Alhamdulillah, there's so many questions coming. It's definitely an interesting subject. Leaving the West aside, leaving the Oriental aside, I mean, you can always make this reason or excuse for them that they don't understand the others. It's alien to them, the culture is alien, their creed and religious belief. But looking at the contemporary Muslim world, I mean, you mentioned that they kind of enhances the Islamophobia. I mean, they should know better, right? Because it's their religion, I suppose. They were born into it, they were educated. Now, what is their intention? Are they trying to remove Islam completely from their very identity, by which, if they remove Islam, then they're no longer who they are. They have to adopt an external one. For those Muslims, do they take the same approach in fighting Islamophobia in their respective Muslim society, in the one that we take here? Because obviously we are dealing with a group of people that don't share our value. There is a group of people who claim to be Muslim, who portray themselves as the caretaker, custodian of Islam, and yet they come up with the same approach as some people in the West.
That's a very good question. I think what we have to understand here, and it's very difficult for sometimes Muslims to accept, because we feel affiliation in faith, and you think, this cannot happen because somebody is a Muslim, he cannot be doing this. The very idea is a lot of the leadership, particularly in the Muslim dominant countries, as I mentioned, have a greater interest to maintain their power because they have not been democratically elected, or they do not represent or reflect the sentiments or the perspective of their people. And hence, their undermining of the Muslims is even greater, because they understand that their society and community knows of an alternative that is much better. So if we take an example of Egypt here. When Morsi stood for elections, all the newspapers that I looked at who went against him used every trope that could have been used in Britain against a Muslim to show them that they were not civilized enough, not westernized enough, not democratic enough, not enlightened enough. It's amazing. This is in Egypt, right? So this was used against the Muslim Brotherhood, and in particularly Morsi. And of course, this was allowed to go ahead when Sisi came into power, and it became even more worse, where Muslims were then even being attacked, and the West then remained silent because the new leader becomes a proxy. It doesn't matter what their name is, what their face is. They are simply a proxy to allow Eurocentrism to travel wider than it already is. And for the leadership itself to be Islamophobic is beneficial because it allows them the power to hold on to power. So in a way, the situation in Muslim dominant countries is worse, I would say. That's why it's much more worse than sometimes in the West, but the geographical West. And therefore we should not be surprised of the great calamities that is befalling Muslims, and particularly those Muslims who become political with a small p in the political arena. For me, politics is everything, so it's a capital P. Whenever you go into a discussion as a political, but in the politics of political party and going into power. So they will not allow that because their society is much more attuned to alternatives. And that is one of the reasons why Khomeini and Iranian Revolution, if you think about it, was so much covered and despised in the West. And up until now, there's sanctions on Iran for one reason or another. But at the bottom of all that is the very idea that you can have a group of people becoming successful for a period in bringing about a change and establishing a nation, whichever way it is, but at least it's surviving. And for that to happen, that cannot travel anywhere. It should be contained. And these are the reasons also, in a way, you see a lot of massive problems throughout the region of the Middle East. It's not because the Middle East itself is violent, it's because the West wishes make sure that there is violence there, and make sure there's no way that any one of them brings about a successful nation that is based on certain ethos and principles that are not necessarily Western-centric. And that is important. It's Western-centric idea. And this also happens not only in Muslim world. If you think about South America, why does America, United States of America, made so many interventions, so many coups d'etats, simply because those regimes were trying to become successful with an alternative method. They did not look at the Western model as the only way to survive. There are other ways to do it. And it is this alternative that threatens it, because they cannot, to be hegemonic, to be superior, to continue with the privileges, you cannot allow any other alternative forms of governance and government to succeed.
Just due to time, Dr. Patel, I'm going to put two questions into one. And the last part will kind of conclude our discussion. As Muslim living in the West, this is our home. This is where we kind of get educated, do everything. How do we keep the relationship? And that might not be directly to your book, but how do you keep the relationship of being part of the ummah and part of a nation state, if such a relationship exists? And the second part is that how do we move beyond Islamophobic atmosphere that we have today? How do we go transcend beyond that? How do we walk in the society, knowing that Islamophobia exists and yet be part of it? Because it's in one way you're kind of being pushed away from the society, that you don't belong there. And another in another dimension, you're trying to be there. So there's an internal battle going on. How do you kind of put them together?
I think that's a half an hour response, but I'll try and be very brief.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay. Let's go, the way you pose the question, I think we need to visit that. I think we shouldn't think of ourselves as being British because we've been educated here, we grew up here, we are born here. No, I think we should think of ourselves as British because we've added value to this country. From our cultural response, our humanity, our philanthropy, our the investment we make through taxations, our investment through our resources of either having businesses or educationers or whatever. So we are a positive contribution to the society. Yeah. So I think that's the very first thing. That we are part and fabric of the society that we live in. And in Britain, in particular in relation to faith, there are faith groups who have aligned to different faiths. In particular, if you look at the Catholics, they have very close relationship with Rome, in particular the Vatican, where they can have this dual. This is what I mentioned. Why is it that people of color are not allowed to have multiple identities? Why is it only people of color are allowed? Only white people are allowed to do that. When it comes to Muslims, why is it a challenge for a Muslim to have sympathy to Britain as well as sympathy to the oppressed, say, in Palestine? There shouldn't be that contradiction. In fact, I would say it is British to be sympathetic to the subjugated and the occupied. That is the British identity we have to bring forward. So in a way, when I talk about the post-racist society, the post-racist society, this is what I'm aiming or trying to bring forward, that Britain itself is something that we should celebrate. Britishness itself, we should celebrate. But that celebration has to come from the ideas from everybody who constitutes what Britain is today. And that idea should not be antagonistic or should not be considered contradictory. So to be a Muslim, to be British, and to be sympathetic to the people who are suffering injustices around the world is part and parcel of Britishness. I don't think there's anything wrong in that at all. The fact that when somebody is dying of hunger, wherever that may be, whether it's in Japan or right across to Denmark or from Rohingya to Sudan, Muslims, should get out there and give as much as they can. And they do. And we are the best in this country, in Britain. Britain needs to celebrate that. We need to be celebrated for who we are. And we need to be very confident that what we are doing to Britain is we're enriching for what Britishness is. And there's a group of people who do not want that to be acknowledged, accepted, and celebrated. And that is the challenge that we have to take on board. And Muslims, I think, in Britain should be proud of themselves, of what they've achieved in the few decades that we've been here. We, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, answering your question, that we are now positive contributors to the society in this country, despite all the legislations that try to stigmatize us, and there are many that try to marginalize us, try to show us in all sorts of negative tropes, but we still carry on. And we should carry on. And we keep on, by carrying on and making the wider of concerns, circle of concern wider. What I mean by that is by talking to different people, approaching different organizations, and these are non-Muslim organizations I'm talking about, involving in every walk of life, and making sure that we express ourselves in the best possible way, then I think we will be able to challenge those who are trying to undermine us, and hopefully take Britain in a place where it should be, a much brighter Britain that reflects what Britishness should be and should be celebrated globally.
Jazakumullah khairan, Dr. Patel, for your presentation on your latest book. Hope to have you in the channel very soon. And I encourage everyone to visit our website, Islamic Literary Society, and take benefit from it and inshallah contribute Twitter in terms of book reviews and any other ways that's possible. So once again, Jazakumullah for your time and your vet, and wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.